Hello, welcome to the overview of the second practice round. Try and keep this tight for you so that it doesn't take too long and prepare you for the first competition round that'll be opening up middle of this week, the week I'm posting the video. So as you can see on the initial screen here, we did have all 6 teams profitable, fantastic, and in the case of Digby, they've made it back into positive territory for the cumulative profit as well. That's fantastic. Not a lot of difference in terms of leverage. We have some significant differences in terms of return on sales with Andrews, Chester, and Erie doing exceptionally well there. Return on equity, we have actually Chester doing the best there, and return on assets, Chester doing the best there. So as you can see, Chester has a bit of an edge in terms of how hard both their equity investment and the assets they've purchased are working for them, and their sales are generating efficiently for them as well, as is the case for Andrews and Erie also. I always take a look at the balanced scorecard, sorry. And first I'm going to show you the top 10 rankings, which compare us to everybody else in the world. And I'm going to switch it to tournament, which is what we're running. And for the round, we can see that in the lead was Chester, which isn't too surprising considering what we just took a look at. Followed by Ferris, then Andrews, then Baldwin, then Erie, and Digby making up some ground here now at 23. Remember, this is where we were in round 1 of the practice round. So let's go back to round 2. From an overall standpoint, I'd like to see all teams at 50th or above by the time we hit the end of the competition rounds. Right now, we have 4 teams making that mark. We have Andrews and Chester in the 80th percentile, so you're doing better than 80% of the other companies competing in the world. We have Ferris coming in at 72, Erie at 51. And then we have Baldwin at 43 and Digby at 14, still reflecting the rough first round for Digby. And again, this is all going to get wiped out at the end of this round, or when I reset the middle of the week here, and we'll start from scratch. But that's where we're at right now. If we look at the star analysis, we can see that for this round, we had all teams with at least 4 stars and Andrews with 5. Everybody avoided the emergency loan. Baldwin, Chester, and Digby have a little work to do on margins, and Ferris and Erie have a little work to do on their inventory management. In other words, whether or not they've produced sufficient but not too much to meet demand. Looking at the analyst report, we can see that everybody's got a little room to work left on margins. Everybody's at least halfway in terms of expectations for working capital, and Chester's doing very well there. Not surprisingly, lots of room to work in terms of forecasting, although Erie has made great strides there. Customer satisfaction, and remember, you can read what customer satisfaction is judged by if you come down here and click this on your report. And it'll show you how the score was calculated. We'll normally only show this for your team. And we'll explain the expectations to receive the points for this. You have to sell at least 50 units, which is 50,000 units. You can't stock out unless you are using a complete second shift, in which case you couldn't have produced any more. Your survey score has to be 30 or more, and this is one of the places where we're losing some ground there. We're not quite there on a lot of our products. It has to been available for sale for the entire year, so anything that is introduced in the year doesn't get counted. So we're also losing some points here because some new products are coming out, and that's normal. There's nothing you can do about that. And then it goes on and helps you understand how the product, the price, the promotion, and the place contribute to the December customer survey score. And we're actually going to look at customer survey scores here in a few minutes and take a look at how those are performing and how they may reflect some of the differences that we're seeing. For the overall scores, we're looking at Chester in the lead at 1494, followed very closely by Andrews at 1475, not too far back. We have Ferris at 1321, Erie at 1272, Baldwin at 1098, and Digby at 869. I did forget to come in here, I apologize, and look at our balanced scorecard. Now, one of the things to note about the balanced scorecard for the second round, both practice and competition, is that there are more points available. So we went from 82 possible points to 89 possible points. What that suggests is if your score didn't rise by at least 7 points, you lost ground. If it rose by 7 points, you essentially stayed flat. Based on that, everybody at least lost a little bit of ground this round. The closest to not losing ground would have been, I think, Baldwin here, just lost a little bit of ground. We've got Chester. It looks like they gained a little ground. They actually lost a little ground. That's okay. That's normal. That's not something to be worried about. Certainly, if you manage to raise your score at all, which Baldwin certainly did, Chester certainly did, Digby certainly did, Erie did slightly, and Ferris did, that's good. That's better than the opposite. But there are more points available. It'll be 89 in the third competition round as well. And then from round 4 on, we go to 100 points per round. But these are not bad scores, especially because these are the practice rounds and you're still figuring things out. And it's certainly much better than the alternative where everybody drops backwards significantly. Now, this is the last time I'll dive into the actual detail score for any team. And that's just to remind you how to do it. In the future, I won't, because it would show you things from your competition you wouldn't see. But you will be able to do that for your own scores. So really, let's take Chester, since Chester is doing very well right now. If we look at the final score, Chester's at 238 with Andrews at 231. Following that up, we had Ferris at 216, Erie at 192, Baldwin at 188, and Digby at 161. So let's just go into Chester's for round 2. And this is just a reminder that you can come in here and see the point breakdown for the balanced scorecard. And we can see here that as far as financial goes, we've got a clean card here, 25 out of 25. Fantastic job there. We can see that we're not doing too bad on internal business processes, 19.2 out of 25. A little less well on the customer, 14.6 out of 25. Learning and growth, we're 2.3 out of 14. And so we might take a look at what's causing that. For instance, employee productivity, where we didn't get any points. So we can click that. And that tells us we want to see employment productivity somewhere at least between the range 100 to 102. You get full credit for greater than 102. This is affected by the HR decisions you were making for this round. And it's normal for you not to have very many points here as of yet, because of the fact that you've just started the HR decisions. However, you should at least be at the 100%. This will also be improved later when we get to the TQM decisions, which come in round 4, and we'll be talking about those later when we get to round 4. Another area that Chester was weak on in their balanced scorecard was customer accessibility. So we'll go ahead and give that a click. And they want to see customer accessibility in the range of 50 to 90% for partial credit and greater than or equal to 90% for full credit. It's perfectly normal to not be at the greater or equal to 90% at this point. It takes time to build accessibility and awareness. However, this would suggest, since we had 0 points here, that we've actually lost ground on this. And we'll take a look at where that comes from as well here in a little bit. So you can come in and take a look at these for your team. You can also click on the recap score and see the slightly different balanced scorecard that's used there and do the same type of analysis. The more detailed analysis, again, comes from the analyst report. That's where you get a lot of information about what's impacting that particular metric and a lot of guidance as to how to improve that metric if you wish. I'll also remind you, too, that you can come into the debrief, which you get to a slightly different way than I do. And you can go in and see the rubric debrief. I showed that to you in the last video. And remember, that's a very, very detailed report that breaks down a whole lot of different aspects of how your company is operating, initially in graphical bar charts, then in a textual presentation showing you the score that you're getting for each of these metrics and the ranges for excellent, satisfactory, poor, and trouble ratings. This is your value here. And then a really pretty useful set of column charts for your products, as well as an overall average for your products that will help you identify problem areas for these metrics here. And remember too for that there is a key that you can download that will give you additional information on how to interpret the rubric debrief report. So it's another analytical tool for you to use. You obviously won't spend much time in it this week because all of these results will be wiped out soon. But in future rounds, don't forget about this tool and how it can help you. All right, let's go ahead to the Capstone Courier for the current round. Please remember, when we begin the competition rounds, you will want to go back to using the round 0 Capstone Courier, but for right now, we're going to look at the round 2 Courier. There we go. Sorry, I opened my soda and it made a little bit of a hiss. As we said, nobody had any emergency loans, so that's fantastic. We see some variation in return on sales across the top here. Let me zoom in a bit. Leading the return on sales right now is Andrews, followed closely by Erie and then Chester. Return on assets, leading that is Chester, followed by Andrews and then Erie. Return on equity, leading that is Chester, followed by Andrews and then Erie, and so on and so forth. We can see some difference in the amount of sales. We can see that Erie is lagging a bit in terms of sales at about 89 million. Leading at nearly 200 million is Chester. We can see also the contribution margins across the bottom of this, and our leader there is Erie. While Erie had relatively low sales, they were, I'm sorry, not leading. That's actually Ferris is leading at 35.7, but Erie actually came in at second at 33.3. So they have a fair amount of efficiency in terms of their sales. Their sales are working fairly decently for them. And remember, we saw the top with the 7.3. Now, in the case of Ferris, the overall contribution margin is very good at 35.7, but their sales aren't working quite as hard for them at only a 4.6. So their efficiencies are coming elsewhere, and we'll see that as we go through. And this is the financial sheet. We can see that we had a general improvement in stock for several companies, some flattening for 3 of our companies, and Digby turned things around a bit from their first round in theirs. We can also see if the game was going to continue from this point, which of course it isn't, when the next bonds would come due. That would be in 2023. This is the end of 2021, so that would be not this coming round, but the next round if the game was continuing at this point with the practice rounds. Just to reiterate something I said in the last update video, when you make improvements to your facilities, when you buy more capacity and you buy automation, and later when you make improvements for TQM decisions too, I believe, it's a good idea to finance those one of 2 ways, generally through debt or equity. Otherwise, what you are left relying on is that you will generate sufficient cash from your revenues to be able to pay for those investments that you've made. Teams didn't do too badly with this time. So take for an example Andrews here, the first column. Let me move up a little bit so you can see Andrews. So Andrews spent about $5.5 million in capacity and automation improvements, and then they raised about $7.5 million, partially from the sale of stock and partially from long-term debt, in roughly a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, as you look into the leverage metrics in the balance scorecard and also in the rubric debrief, you will see that it actually rewards you for taking slightly more debt than you do equity. That reflects what investors would expect as well. They don't want to be bearing the majority of the load. They prefer to see you taking debt and using debt to fund your expansions. So approaching a 2-to-1 ratio is sort of ideal, but each team has to make their own philosophical decisions about how they want to approach financing. In the case of Baldwin spent a little over $9 million in improving the plant. They raised $16.5 million, a little more than they actually needed. That's not wrong, it's not bad. They did, however, raise much, much more through the sale of stock than they did through issuing long-term debt. Now, I understand from a consumer standpoint how we all feel about debt, but realize that you have said to your shareholders, I am going to make you bear much more of the risk for my investments than I am the banks. And there are complications introduced when you do this, one of which is you greatly dilute your shares, which depresses your stock price. If we look at Baldwin's stock price performance, we see that Baldwin increased their stock price by $2.39. That's a reflection of their generally positive results. However, we can see that's peanuts compared to Andrews, compared to Chester, compared to Digby, compared to Erie. Only Ferris had a smaller change in stock price. So that was partially because you have significantly diluted your shares. Now, you can make up this ground later. I'm not saying that what you did was wrong, but you have created a situation where your price to earnings ratio is quite high, so your stock is potentially overvalued. And it doesn't quite reflect the earnings of the company. So it is a decision that you have to make how you want to handle financing, but in general, you're probably looking at close to a 2-to-1 ratio between debt, both long and short-term debt, compared to stock. In the case of Chester, they spent about $2.5 million, and they raised a total of $6.9 million, raised a little bit more than they needed to. They decided to make use of some current debt borrowing. You may do that. Current debt has pluses and minuses. Of course, it has to be paid back the very next round. The interest rates aren't bad. Generally, we use this to support projected cash shortfalls, but you may use it as you see fit along with the long-term debt. In the case of Erie, we see something interesting. They actually brought in $28 million in cash. And how did they do that? Well, obviously, they sold off some capacity they didn't believe they were going to need. There's nothing the matter with that. And certainly, it would be far better to sell off capacity and recapture that portion of the original cost that you are given back whenever you do that, if you're sure you're not going to need it. However, it would be a losing proposition to sell off capacity that you would then later have to rebuy. So you want to project far enough in the future to really know, am I ever going to need that capacity? Times that you sell off capacity would be when you know you're heading towards discontinuing a product, perhaps to correct a previous overcapacity situation where you had bought too much capacity. Remember that you can run 2 full shifts on your capacity, so you can do double what your current capacity is. And we'll see what that looks like here for a second on the next page. So let me scroll down a little bit to that page. We can see that Chester is producing in excess of their capacity. This is actually what we want to see. We want to see that you're making full use of your available capacity, and full use would be producing everything the first shift can produce and selling that, and also producing everything that second shift can produce and selling that. The key is, of course, being able to sell the products. You ideally don't want to be underproducing your capacity. That's the situation here for Digby. This capacity is costing you money. It costs you money to buy, and it's not doing anything. So this is a lack of efficiency. However, Baldwin's doing it too, Andrews is doing it too, and it's not unusual early in the game. You may be planning on needing that capacity later. So I'm not criticizing this situation. I'm just saying ideally what we want to do is make full use of our capacity. We want to see plant utilization approach 200%. If we get to 200%, it'll actually be 199. That's also a bad situation because we can't produce any more. And if we're stocking out at that point, that suggests that at some point earlier, at least one round earlier, we should have bought some more capacity. As far as plant utilizations go, let's take a look at Erie because we know that Erie sold off some capacity. And how else can we tell that? Well, if we can compare their capacity for their traditional line, 1176, to the capacity we have here for the traditional line for Digby, 1800, Chester, 1800, Baldwin, 1800, we can tell they sold off some of the capacity. If we look at the capacity for the high, we can see they're at 550. If we compare that to some others, we see 900, 900, 900. We know they sold off some there. You also notice that Erie has chosen to no longer have a low product line. And so they also sold off that capacity as well. I don't know if they did that this round or the previous round. I apologize. So we can see that they've made some definite choices, and if we look at their plant utilization, we see we're at 105% for traditional and just about 100% for the others. And we only stocked out on traditional. We have a very reasonable amount left behind on high performance and size. This was pretty good forecasting. They had room to produce more for traditional, and clearly they should have produced more for traditional so that they didn't stock out. And in fact, if you look at the traditional products across the board, everybody stocked out. So everybody could have produced some more there. In the case of these product lines, we see that they have room to produce twice what they actually produced. They produced at 100% basically, and they could produce up to double what you're seeing here. So they have some room to do better there, but they did not produce more, and they were right to not produce more for this round. These are, again, reasonable amounts to have left behind with these levels of sales. So this is pretty good forecasting. I would mention that if Erie doesn't have any plans, assuming this game was going to continue from this second practice round, to introduce any new products, they are running on a fairly narrow base. You are competing against the other teams. And so right now, Erie is running only 4 products compared to their competitors that are all running at least 5 products. And in some cases, in the case of Ferris here, are potentially going to run many more. So be careful that you don't narrow your base too much, but of course it's guided by your strategy. I'm going to come down and again show you that in traditional, everybody stocked out, so everybody left money on the table. Everybody could have done better. So that's something to keep in mind. These products you see at 0% and 0 December customer survey score. These are products that customers who wanted traditional products bought because they were close enough, even though they weren't really traditional products. So these are the products that are down here on the high end of low, for instance, and traditional customers will buy products that are in this rough cut, the dotted line, if they absolutely have to. Buddy is an interesting one. Buddy was actually coming in from the side here, not really a traditional product quite as of yet, but it made it into the rough cut, and so some customers did buy that. Heck, 5 customers, well, 5,000 units were actually sold of Bold, which was coming in from the other side, from those wing segments. I think the most interesting of the segments to look at for this round, however, let me come down to it. I believe I wanted to look at, performance. Okay. So let's remind ourselves of a couple of things for the performance segment. The most important criteria for customers is reliability. That's almost half of the buying decision. Another close to a third of the buying decision is the actual position. 20% is the price. About 10% is the age, which should be 1. And I want to come in and look at a couple specific products. I want to focus on 2 products that did not stock out because it's hard to tell how many products would have sold if we hadn't stocked out for foam and for aft. So let's look instead at Coat from Chester and Edge from Erie. I'm going to start over here. We notice that Coat has a customer survey score of 23. We see that Edge has a customer survey score of 21. Now the customer survey score, if you go through that analysis I showed you earlier when we were looking at the analyst report, is a sum total assessment of how the customer feels about your product that takes into consideration these metrics, the price, the performance, the place, et cetera, et cetera. let's look at what was actually responsible for this difference in sales for the product. It's not a huge difference. 572,000 units for Coat, 487 for Edge. Well, we see that actually Coat came to market in its current form a little bit later, not by much, but 20 days, than Edge. If anything, that should have given Edge the edge. Yeah, I know. We can see positioning-wise, they're a little different, 10.0 and 15.6 compared to 10.2 and 15.3. The actual expectation is 11.4 and 14.6, but that's not a huge difference for either of those, but it might be partially responsible for it. We're a little better on performance here than we are for Edge than we are for Coat. We're a little better on size for Coat than we are for Edge, and so they're probably pretty close to overlapping here. Of course, you can't actually see it in this depiction. So I would expect this might be a little bit of the difference, but not a lot. We look at the price. Now, price is only 10% of the equation here. It's $34 for Coat. It's $34.50 for Edge. It's also $34.50 for Foam. Now, why am I paying attention to that? Well, a mistake's been made here that's a common mistake, and it's best to make it during the practice round. Notice that the price range for this round was 24 to 34. For every dollar above the price range, or below it for that matter, for every dollar outside the price range, you lose 20% of your customer survey score that you should have earned. So for 50 cents, you lost 10% of your customer survey score. That then directly leads to a lessening of demand. So what happened was the companies who were running, in the case of Foam, Ferris, and the case of Edge, Erie, these two products forgot to change their price to reflect the new price range. Remember, the price range that you see on the Capstone Courier is going to be decreased by 50 cents for the next round. So if we were doing a round 3 from here, the top edge of the price range for the performance product would be $33.50, and the bottom would be $23.50. So you have to remember to do that little bit of math in your head. Again, this is the perfect time to make that mistake. So Foam actually should have had a slightly better customer survey score, and Edge should have had a slightly better customer survey score. And in fact, if the customer survey score had reflected the proper pricing of 34, it would have been very, very close to the same as Coat. So that makes us wonder then again, what's responsible for the difference in sales, especially when we look at reliability. And we see that Edge has actually a better reliability than Coat does. In fact, Edge has the best reliability of anybody in this segment, and they are right at the top of the most important metric. That should lead them to expect that their product will be very well received. Now, it wasn't poorly received, but it was greatly outsold by a product with a lesser reliability that also had the same price problem that they had. So now things get really interesting. Not only are we looking at Edge compared to Coat, we're also asking, well, how did Foam sell so much better when their price was incorrect? Their positioning isn't significantly different. In fact, when you look at the positioning for Foam compared to the positioning for Edge, there is near enough to be identical as to probably make no major difference. Their most important criteria, reliability, is actually worse. Not a lot worse, but it's worse. Why did they sell better? Well, first thing we see is age. We see that they got to market much earlier, and we see that because they had R&D'd it also in the previous round, their age is 1.89, Edge's age is 2.54. To go back to Coat, 1.7. So Coat actually is closer to the ideal age of 1 than either Foam or Edge. So that's part of it. Now, age is not an extremely important attribute. It's only 10%, but it is something important. I think I said earlier that price was 10%, it's 20%. So this is part of the equation. But then we get to these columns right here. Well, sorry, I can't really do that. We get the promo budget and sales budget, which lead to customer awareness and customer accessibility. And now we start to see the difference. We look at Edge. A $950,000 expenditure on the promo budget gave them a 51% awareness, and $850,000 sales budget gave them a 24% accessibility. We originally were comparing them to Coat. Well, look at Coat. Coat is at 62% on awareness and at 40% on accessibility. We can compare them to Foam, and we see that Foam is now at 100% on awareness and 53% on accessibility. So you want to pay attention, again, to that page. I believe it's page 12 or 14. Right now I'm not remembering which it was, in the team member guide that explains to you how the promo budget and the sales budget work. Please pay attention to the S-curve that is depicted for that to help you understand where you start to hit diminishing returns, and to also understand how the decay in awareness and accessibility works. So you lose a third of it each round. A certain amount of expenditure on those two budgets will hold the ground, will take back what you had lost, and you got to put a little bit more in to gain some ground. If you look that up, actually, remember 27 and 26 is what we have here. Let me go to the guide. Let's see if I was right about 14. Nope, it's 12. Okay. So this is where we were at. We see that they put $2,700 into the promo budget. So $2,700 on the promo budget would be, let's call it right around in here. One of the things that I would remind Ferris of is, did you really get that much of an advantage being here as opposed to, say, here? You only gained a little bit of height from 25 to 27. So this is what I mean by diminishing returns. The curve flattens out. So each additional dollar, once you pass 15, starts to get you less and less. That doesn't mean don't spend more than 15. I'm not saying you did anything wrong here. Now at 3,000, you get absolutely no additional return for another dollar. So 4 million, 5 million, 6 million would be an absolute total waste of that excess money. But in this range up here, the difference between 2.5 million and 2.7 million is a very, very small difference in increase. So you may have overspent there a little bit. It did get you to 100%, absolutely correct. It got you an additional nearly 50% in additional awareness. In terms of the expenditures on the sales budget, 26, so 2.6 million they put into that. 2.6 is right around in this range, give or take. So it'd be right about there. 2.5 would have been right there. So the difference between 2.5 and 2.6, relatively small. And the diminishing returns here for a single product start to creep in when you hit this point, and the max hits right here. This is also affected by having 2 or more products. You can't get to 100% in the sales budget until you have at least 2 products. The 2 promotional budgets, the promotion budget and the sales budget, I'm sorry, the 2 marketing budgets do work a little bit differently. This one travels with the product, this one stays with the segment. But you do want to go back and review this information and perhaps review the tutorial about it so that you use this money appropriately. Now again, I'm not saying Ferris did anything wrong, because certainly it paid off for them. The only thing Ferris did wrong is they didn't make enough of this product. Could Ferris have made more of that product? Well, they stocked out. If we go up here and we look at Ferris and their traditional product, which is, their performance product, I apologize, which is foam, we see that their capacity was 850 and they ran at 116%. So they absolutely could have made some more of that product. Now, forecasting how much to make and how much excess to have, sitting behind, that's something you'll be struggling with throughout the game, and you'll continue to refine your technique as you go. A result like we see here, for what Erie was able to do, other than the stock out on their traditional product, this is excellent. If we assume for a moment that Chester absolutely positively meant for this to happen, you don't get any better than that. One product left in the warehouse tells you you left no extra money on the table, and you absolutely minimized your overstock, your inventory carrying costs. Of course, they stocked out every place else. These are some not bad results here. Well, this one's not great, I'm sorry. Where else was I looking? I know I had another really good one. Oh, this one right here, I'm sorry, there it is, was Ferris again. Ferris with their Fist product. 12 units left behind with 993 sold. It doesn't get much better than that. So you do want to keep working on that and refining it. You want to review the guidance on how to forecast in both the online help and the team member guide. That'll give you some more information there. Since you had HR decisions this round, even though they won't have a major impact as of yet, let me come down to where those are recounted. So what you'll notice here on the productivity index is that Baldwin's at 102.7. Where did this come from? Well, look at what they spent on their recruiting cost and look at what they spent on their training cost. Now, they were not the biggest spender on the recruiting cost. That would have been Chester. But they combined that with a significant expenditure on their training cost. And together, that got them 102.7% productivity index. So their people are producing more than the other companies are able to produce. For the same number of people, they're able to produce more if all other things are equal. We also notice where else this came from, and this is probably actually the real story, their recruiting spend. They're hiring better people. So they put a significant amount of money. I'm not saying they put the right amount of money into it, but they decided to spend money to recruit better employees in the first place. So they recruited better employees. They spent money on training them. The overall recruiting cost for the employees is more than most of the other companies are spending. And what that did for them was it got them that increase in their productivity index. For those teams that also put in decent expenditures on the recruiting spend, don't be discouraged. If this practice round was to go into another round instead of us resetting, you would start to see the impact of that. You would start to see the impact of your training hours. You would start to see the impact of spending more money on recruiting. So it's not that you did anything wrong, it's just that it takes time for it to build. Baldwin put enough money into it up front that they got an initial burst. Again, I'm not saying they put the right amount of money into it. That's something that you as a team have to decide. But over time, this starts to build. You will also see that when we start doing the key TQM decisions, there are some things you can do that will improve productivity as well. And will also affect many other attributes of how your company runs, but we'll wait for that until we get to round 4. Now, please keep in mind, you will not be working with the HR decisions in the first competition round. They will come back into play on the second competition round when we get to that. And this is where we'll eventually see the TQM stuff recounted as well. So that is a basic and fairly quick overview of the second practice round. Again, I'm very happy. This was a good practice round. Hopefully by now you have a slightly better idea of what it is you want to do with your strategy and where you want to take your team in the competition rounds. I will get those rounds reset middle of this week, as I had said in my email. And at that point, you can start working on the competition rounds. Please remember to also participate in the discussion boards as detailed in the syllabus as well. Thank you very much, and email me if you have any questions. Take care.